Good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Green. I'm director of the USC Lusk Center, and welcome to our third Zoominar on the impact of COVID on the economy and real estate and so on. And as we're planning these out, once we get past the first month, we probably will do some of these on things other than COVID, because we're pretty sure people are going to want to hear about things other than COVID at some point. Before I turn it over to our guest speaker this morning, just a couple of comments on some economic things I've been thinking about the last couple of days. The first is, of course, tomorrow will be a big day, April Fool's Day, in that we will see how much rent gets collected. And I'm going to make a small forecast that I'm prepared to be embarrassed about if I'm wrong, which is, I think on the apartment side, rent collections are going to be better than people think for the following reason. So I was actually talking to somebody I have a lot of respect for an hour ago, who was worried about the moral hazard issue of eviction moratoriums. And what I hang my hat on is the following: is if you look at Las Vegas in 2009, when people had an enormous incentive to default on their mortgages, so house prices had fallen by about 70%, pretty much everybody was upside down. If you remove the following people, if you remove people who just lied about whether they were living in the house or not, if you remove people who had exotic mortgage products, and if you remove people who didn't lose their jobs or didn't go through a divorce, the default rate in Las Vegas was very, very small. And some work I did 3 or 4 years ago with some folks at the Urban Institute showed that people who were current on their mortgages kept current on their mortgages regardless of their equity position, which is sort of one of these things that surprised me, but that I learned from the crisis. And so people who can pay their bills are actually very serious about paying their bills. So certainly people who have lost their hourly wages and don't have any money, they're not paying the rent. So you're going to see large increases in rent defaults. But I don't expect to see a wave of people who are still capable of paying their rents in apartments to cease paying their rents. So we'll, of course, know in a couple of days whether I'm right or not about that. But there's some history on my side that way. The other thing, though, I am very worried about the plumbing of the mortgage market falling apart. And the reason for that is because most lenders who are non-bank lenders have big-time liquidity issues. And on that note, let me turn it over to our guest speaker, Clayton Dube, who runs the USC China Institute. Many of you will recall that Clay spoke to us at the retreat couple of years ago. He was a big hit. And US-China relations, I think it would be an understatement to say, are kind of important at the moment. Even apart from the health environment we're dealing with just more broadly in terms of thinking about the economy going forward, what changes we might see as a result of this relationship. And so I'm going to introduce someone who needs no further introduction. Clay, thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning.
It's great to be with everybody. I hope that you can hear me. As it happens, there's all sorts of economic activity in my neighborhood. So you may hear construction saws. You certainly hear leaf blowers and mowers and things like that. So there are some things going on. It's a great honor to be back with you, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Oh, and Clay, let me just remind people what we did yesterday. So if you have a question for Clay, use the chat room to send that to me personally, and then I will make sure that he gets the question.
No, that's great. And feel free to ask about whatever it is that concerns you. Most things I have no clue about. A few things I do. And I'll try to distinguish those answers. You've already had some presentations about staying safe. And maybe you've all also had a presentation or two about staying sane, how to maintain relationships, how to stay upbeat, how to deal with house arrest, as it were, right? Those kinds of things. Now we're going to say something about staying solvent. Okay, so that's maybe the challenge of the moment. And so I'll go ahead now and share my screen. And as Richard suggested, please go ahead and post questions in the chat room. Post them to him. You can share things with the group. All of that is welcome. Feel free to reach out to me apart from this as well. So we're going to be looking at China's economic outlook. And why should that matter? Well, China's economic outlook led first to a market crash here in the United States and may be a signal about things to come. And so let's see if we can move forward. So social distancing, right? That's what we're engaged in. That's why we're using Zoom to get together today. And the models suggest that if you manage this on day one, with a 75% reduction in your contact, and you happen to have COVID-19, you would only, after 30 days, have infected an additional 2.5 people. Now that obviously doesn't quite work. You can't be half infected. But 3, as opposed to with no social distancing, you would have had that multiplier effect and have infected 406 people. Now that's pretty dramatic. And so we have begun to social distance. And you folks have all seen this chart. You've seen, unemployment spike up at bad times. The gray areas on the chart in front of you indicate recessions. And we have never, in the history of calculating this stuff, never seen the kinds of unemployment claims that came up last week. Some people were projecting that by the end of June, we might have 3 million unemployment claims. We got that in week 1. Macy's just announced 130,000 people furloughed, all of that sort of thing. So of course, the impact is massive, especially for an economy that is driven 70% by people buying things. If they don't have work, they're just not going to be able to buy. And so you folks are all familiar with what's happened on the stock market. Again, this massive, massive sell-off. Well, what drove this? What drove this was a late realization that the world's second largest economy had ground to a halt, that China's economy went on freeze, went on pause. And so this is not a trick shot. This is the center of Shanghai's financial district. At midday, no one, a police officer, a car, no one out, right? And that's the freezing. So let's go to Beijing. This is Beijing on February 7th. And so look at the stop. Look at the complete stop in malls, in restaurants, everywhere. If you need food, you have to have it delivered. And so if you're an investor, the bright spot is can be a company like Meituan Dianping, which delivers food. But in fact, they were on board for their biggest year ever, and now they've even been hit. And you can see China's propaganda effort to slow the spread of the virus. This is a single doorway, but they managed to have 2 giant posters about protecting health, what you need to do to protect health. And in China, people were frozen in place. You could go out on an odd-even system, 1 person from a household every couple of days to get food, things like that. We don't have anything like that here, right? If you wanted to, you could go line up at Costco every morning. So what happened? What happened? So this is the Purchasing Managers Index, and it's an imperfect tool, but it does give us a hint. And so what did we see? If the number is, and these are indices, so if the number is over 50, it looks like the economy is expanding. If the number is below 50, the economy is contracting. And here are these stats produced by Caixin, one of the most reputable news organizations in China. In fact, I would say the most credible news organization in China. It's semi-independent, it gets reined in, but it's not, strictly speaking, a propaganda tool. So here we have, on the left, non-manufacturing and also services. And what do we see? A virtual collapse. A virtual collapse. In January, services are expanding. Non-manufacturing here means services and construction expanding. But in February, collapse, 27, 30, the lowest figures ever measured since they began this index in 2005. And you see the same thing, of course, in manufacturing. So that documents the hit to the Chinese economy. And it took a while for markets outside of China to recognize the importance of this, to recognize that this would have consequences. Second largest economy in the world and the number one source for global growth over the past decade. And so what happens in China has consequences. Now, here are a couple of charts that just came out recently from the Institute of International Finance. And the key point here is to note that this is still China that we're talking about, that in terms of industrial production, retail sales, and fixed asset investment, fell off a cliff, just fell off a cliff. And even compared to the hit in SARS in 2003 and the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, this is much, much greater. Those hits were a little bit more localized in the case of SARS and not as steep in the case of the financial crisis. This is dramatic. And when you look at real estate, home sales down 39%, housing starts down 44%. And so the impact is just dramatic. So let me talk about Starbucks, right? This iconic American brand. Starbucks, their biggest growth market is China. And so they had 4,290 stores. They had 58,000 employees. And they began to close. And ultimately, they closed every single store throughout the country. Ordinarily, Starbucks in China opens a store every 15 hours. Unprecedented in retail. Now, 95% of the stores are reopening, but with the same sorts of things that we see here, takeout only, maintain your distances, that sort of thing. So a couple weeks ago, the business press caught on. We have The Economist emphasizing the coronavirus challenge, but we also have Business Week highlighting not just that, but China's debt burden, both the public debt as well as the corporate debt and household debt, which has become a big issue in China. The ongoing trade war, keep in mind that most of the tariffs are still in place. They might be slightly lower, but they're still in place, plus protests in Hong Kong, right? These kinds of issues. So the world is looking to China. I think we need to look to China a little bit more industriously, a little bit more proactively, so as to avoid being dragged into these kinds of issues. To a certain extent, it's inevitable. And so Americans just discovered, all of us take medicines, most of us take some kind of medicine, and 90% of the medicine that we take is a generic. And most of those generics, 70, 80%, come from India. But we just found what? That India uses in those medicines about 70% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. So it turns out that supply chain has also been impacted. Only drug companies are required to notify the FDA if a drug is in shortage. And so at the time of this article, one drug was already in shortage, and they were going to work around it. But what's important to note is device companies do not report. And of course, 63 of the most important medical device companies have operations in China. And essentially for a couple months, those were shut down. Just when the United States should have been getting all the materials that it needs to prepare for its own challenges. Now, it's not just pharmaceuticals, it's cameras, it's copiers, it's the stuff that Canon makes. Canon had to shut down 5 factories in Japan because they didn't have the parts from suppliers in China. Automakers fell apart. First, requiring brakes, but also other things like electrical components and things like that for cars. On top of that, the shutdown in northern Italy has had a big impact. Now, I'd like to bring this to a discussion of our integration and bring it to a question of US policy, because this is, kind of magnifying, putting a magnifying glass on our relationship. Many Americans kind of go through their day without thinking about the ways the United States and China are interconnected. But we are interconnected across the board. And so it's important to be mindful of that. And the trade war helped people to come to understand this. But of course, the coronavirus shutdown has brought it home even more dramatically. Now, beginning in 2017, the Trump administration said, this is a problem. This is a problem. That China has become prosperous, China has become a technological rival, and China has become militarily powerful. And it concluded that the source of those 3 things was what? Access to the US economy and access to American universities. And if you conclude that, it's easy, perhaps, to suggest that what? Maybe the United States would benefit from less integration. And there are many people who suggest this. I spoke with a former senator and a former member of Congress, one a Republican, the other a Democrat. And I was talking about this, and the Democrat said, maybe we need less integration. Maybe we need less connection because of this. And so he became an advocate for kind of systematic decoupling. Now, this chart just indicates the flow of students. And at USC, we have 6,200 students from China. And many of them are still here in Los Angeles or in surrounding areas. And they're wondering what to do. Flying out is hard. First of all, there are a few flights. Second of all, if they go, they could be quarantined upon arrival in China. How do they get around in China? All kinds of issues. They're debating, Richard mentioned rent a little while ago about April 1st looming. They're debating, well, should I spend money on an expensive plane ticket or should I spend money on rent? So major issues. Well, Fitbit. So Fitbit is, of course, a famous company, and Fitbit gathers data. And its data shows that people are walking less. In the United States last week, they walked 12% less than the same time a year before. In China, which supposedly is coming back on, they walked 16% less. Now, there are all kinds of potential problems with this data. But again, I saw this and I said, well, that's interesting. Tell me more about Fitbit. Well, so I went to their annual report, which, as it happens, came out a month ago. And they highlighted what? Several things. Subject to risks arising from the recent outbreak of the COVID illness. Why? Our stuff comes from China. We don't know if we're going to be able to manufacture it, if we're going to be able to deliver it, all of these kinds of things. How do you plan an advertising campaign if you're not sure the product will be in stores? And it highlights this reliance on China. And it also notes that last year, because of the higher tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, their costs went up 2%. They paid $21 million in increased tariffs last year. So they were highlighting all of these things. Well, Fitbit last year said, because of tariffs, we're going to relocate. We're going to go somewhere else. And they weren't real clear about where they were going to go. And they may not have actually even moved very far in making those plans. But they may have had some inkling of why they would probably need to do this. Because a month later, Google announced that it's paying $2.1 billion to buy Fitbit. Google wants into that. Now, in terms of global market share, in terms of smartwatches, but also headphones and stuff like that, Apple is number one, Xiaomi, the Chinese producer, is number two. Fitbit is down at number 5. And Fitbit has been in the China market for 6 years now, pushing to try and get that. Why would anybody be concerned about the fitness market in China? Well, as it turns out, the wearables market in China is the largest in the world. Let that sink in. So the United States, where we're measuring and doing all of these things, is dwarfed by China. Well, of course, 1.4 billion people doing anything is going to have a bigger impact than 300 million. But this is an important fact. When someone says, why do we produce in China? Most of the companies that are producing in China, although they may have originally gone for lower labor costs, are producing primarily for the Chinese market. Now, they do export back to the United States and these other things, but the China market is growing. And that's why companies have gone there. They've not gone there to somehow advance Chinese geopolitical ambition. They've gone there because it makes business sense. Now, the last time I met with this group, I talked about the companies that were making money in China: General Motors, Yum Brands, a whole host of companies, Procter & Gamble. All of these folks are in China making money. And that's why they're there. They're not there because Beijing treated them well. In fact, they don't always treat them well. But what? I should have noted that Fitbit, I don't know if this deal is going to go through. The European regulatory agencies might have a particular issue with Google having access to still more data. And so wait and see. But if you want it, if you somehow believe that Google's going to get this deal, buy now. Buy Fitbit now at $6 a share, because Google has already promised to pay $7.5. But let's look at the question of stimulus. How much is China going to stimulate? Well, we don't know. We don't have access to the Politburo. The Politburo may not know. They are likely to do this the way they do everything, which is gradually, step by step. Now, I think the South China Morning Post went totally overboard and said that China's got a $7 trillion spending spree planned. I think that's just impossible. And I don't know of anybody besides Yahoo News that picked up on that number, because that would be about 50% of the Chinese economy. And there's no past record that suggests a stimulus of that scale.
So, Clayton, please tell people what the South China Morning Post is.
Sure. South China Morning Post is published in Hong Kong. It's been around for better than a century. It's been an important publication. It's now owned by Alibaba. Okay, so it's owned by that giant tech company, Alibaba, that's responsible for now on the finance side, Alipay, but more famously for Taobao, for Tmall, and things like that. And so it is, and it's blocked, by the way, in China. And so if you're in China, not without a VPN, without a virtual private network, you can't read the South China Morning Post. So it is, again, a useful source, but in this instance, I think not an accurate one. And so I just wanted to highlight that that's probably off the reservation. What Reuters reported a couple weeks ago is almost certainly true, that in fact, the Chinese government is going to do what it usually does, which is bet big on what? Infrastructure. They believe in infrastructure. The kind of core principles of Chinese Communist Party development religion are to invest in infrastructure and education, that these two things will yield dividends. But on what scale? As it happens, the number that has leaked into general discussion is about $400 billion. $400 billion, which is a lot of money, right? Until you come along and pledge $2 trillion. $400 billion, though, is also about what the government put into the stimulus through direct spending in 2008, 2009. That was how China mobilized to ride out the great financial crisis, about $400 billion. But the more important thing they did was loosen the credit tap. And so credit expanded by 400% as well. I think that's already going on, and much of that money is going to state-owned enterprises, which is not ideal. These are the least productive. They are also, they employ the fewest number of people, those sorts of things. There are some people who are worried about Chinese debt. In fact, it turns out that Chinese millennials are deeply in debt. They like to buy, and they're relying on parents to pay and things like that. So you have high debt levels, both at the government side, at the corporate side, which is particularly worrying, and also at the personal, at the household level. But it's unlikely that those are going to, in the short term, be an impediment. And so here are the numbers. So what's going on under the new normal? So China is coming back online. And so in the upper right, you see workers at a Honda factory in the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. And you can see how they've put down on the floor exactly how close you can be, right? At those intersections. And you've got your regulation stool, you have your drink, and you have your food. And so now we're enjoying this with, again, this social distancing. Here is a tech factory that's back online in a north central province. They're not separated quite as much, but you can see everybody is covered. Now, a lot of them would be covered anyway in a tech factory. But the uniformity of the masks is probably a little bit new. How about, again, at that epicenter? So Wuhan, where all of this started in late November, early December, Wuhan coming back to life. So this is a scene from the metro. Everybody is the requisite distance apart, except for Pikachu sitting a little bit too close there, but also skateboarders out and about. And so again, it's moving in this direction, but in fact, we're still a long way from normal in China, certainly in Wuhan, but even in other places. Chinese universities have been online, for the entire stretch since the Spring Festival, the Lunar New Year in late January. And faculty and staff are required to be in their offices, but students are not allowed on the campus. So everything is being done via distance learning, and that's throughout the country. That's not just in Wuhan or some other places. Farther to the south, in Hong Kong, if you go to a mall, and they're hoping that you will, they're hoping to get the economy rolling again, but they don't want you sitting too close. And so you can see in the food court, they've kind of patterned this out, and they said, okay, you can sit where there's not the crime scene tape, right? Where they haven't flagged this out, to force people to have suitable distance, right? And Hong Kong, of course, is one of the most densely populated places on the planet. This is how they're trying to move forward. Now, this, for me, is the most important chart by far. And this came out from the conference board, and it's a little bit behind because we should have advanced that black line a little bit. But the important thing to note is that the black line, the line for COVID-19, it much more closely maps what? The great financial crisis. Okay, you can see with SARS, with 9/11, even with the MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome hit to the S&P 500, those started coming back relatively quickly. This downward trend is quite distinct. Now, the undergirding of the US economy is a whole lot stronger than this, but it's not as robust perhaps as the stock market prior to this suggested. But this is an issue, right? If you look and see about the long-term hit, in part because we were so slow, in some places quite inept and haphazard, right? There was nothing systematic in the way Americans responded to this threat, even though we should have seen it coming. In 2003, when SARS hit, there were about 200 weekly plane flights between the United States and China, about 200. At the time that this hit, before all the airlines started shutting down, there were 700 weekly flights. We were far more interconnected. The size of the Chinese economy, of course, had gone from 4% of the global economy to 13% of the global economy. We should have seen both the health threat and the economic challenge coming. Now, the best business to be in, the face mask business, right? And so one factory owner in China, he said, it's a license to print money, just print money. And so you've had 9,000 companies respond. And I don't want to suggest that the only reason they are doing this is for profit. Many are doing it because they recognize the huge human cost, the dislocation to society. But a lot of these folks also see the opportunity to make money. And so China today is turning out 116 million masks on an average, on a daily average, right? But the demand to make these masks has increased so rapidly that the cost for the fabric that goes into these masks has shot up astronomically as well. Now, Interpol sent out a warning about a week and a half ago, too, saying that this is the perfect opportunity for criminals who are already showing up. People who are, in some cases, just taking orders and cashing the check. In other cases, sending things that are not up to standard. And some of this is frankly criminal. And so it's a giant issue. So for hospitals and others who are trying to source, it's difficult to go outside your reliable channels. But the good thing is that many companies that used to rely on 3M, Honeywell, those Honeywell factories, those 3M factories are back up and running now in China. Not at full capacity, but they are operating. Now let's touch for a minute on the social, on the political aspects of this horrible moment in human history. And so President Trump, a little bit more than a week ago, tweeted out, we need to totally protect our Asian American community in the United States. They're amazing people and so forth and so on. It's not their fault. Now, a lot of people say, yeah, nice for you to do that, but for the last 2 weeks, you've been blaming China and you've been using the term Chinese virus, and that has stimulated a certain amount of Asian American discrimination against Asian Americans and others. Now, the picture is from 2016. some Asian American, Chinese Americans who obviously were Trump fans. But a lot of people in the United States and outside the United States thought, in fact, that the president, on purpose or unintentionally, was pointing a finger at Chinese generically in a way that could have been expected to yield discrimination. Health issues have been used in the past, especially towards Chinese Americans in the 19th century and things like that. He should have been aware of it. Others told him about it, but still he persisted. Now he's backtracking a bit, but his administration continues to use this. Now we'll come back to this question in a minute. But discrimination and that sort of thing is not limited to the United States. And so this is a restaurant in Shenyang in northeastern China where they're blaming the United States for the virus, saying, okay, this American virus, and they also are pointing at Japanese in a derogatory way, and they're talking about them, those others. And so this is a bigoted kind of statement. And it's important to note, the only reason I know about this is because it shot around the Chinese chat sphere, and many Chinese were really upset about it. So much so that the very next day, the company that owned the restaurant said the manager did that without our permission, and we have removed that and dismissed the manager. This is the statement to that effect. But it reminds us that we are an odd couple. In 2009, I showed this to the group back in May, I guess, of last year when we got together. And I complained then about, even though Mao was dead for 33 years, art directors were still using him as the symbol of China. Now, you could also complain that Uncle Sam has been out there for a long time too. But fast forward 10 years, and you look at The Economist last fall, and they're highlighting the question of a breakup. What happens if these two countries separate? And my first point is separation is not, total separation is, of course, inconceivable, but it may not be desirable either. But many Americans have changed in their thinking about China, and this is significant. Now, spring 2020 polls, of course, have been disrupted by the coronavirus. I'm not sure when Pew is going to release its 2020 update, but I'd like to draw your attention, first of all, to two things. Number one is the Chinese government won't let these polls be done in China. The Chinese government doesn't want to let the Chinese people say what they think about the United States. It's an interesting dynamic. But in the United States, what do we see? We see a massive decline in American opinion. And so what this measures is, all right, do you have a favorable opinion or not of China? And you can see that younger Americans, under 30, 18 to 30, only a third of them have a favorable impression of China. And older Americans, still have a still lower opinion, especially those over 50. Now, the pattern of younger people being more favorably disposed towards China, that holds throughout this polling. And so that is consistent. But what's stunning is this statistic that I'm showing you, that the more educated you are, the more negative you tend to be. Now, this is a statistic that comes out of the past college age group. And so this is really stunning because in the past, the more educated you were, the more news you consumed and these kinds of things, the more favorably disposed towards China you were. No longer the case. And so I attribute this overall pattern very much to the Trump influence. Trump's influence is immense. And if you look at If I broke this out in terms of political party and things like that, it would be even starker. But what's striking here is that China's abysmal human rights records, especially in Xinjiang, discrimination against women, the oppression of human rights lawyers, all of that has coalesced in the minds of better educated people, and they have a much lower opinion of China than they once did.
Yeah, so Clay, I want to push back a little bit on what you said about Trump being so important, because I'm a reasonably well-educated person. If you asked me 6 or 7 years ago about China, I was sort of thrilled at the direction it was going. You looked at what had happened to the reduction of poverty in the country. It was quite remarkable. It was apparently becoming a more open society, still not what some of us might have hoped it to be, but nevertheless comparing it to what it was at the time of Tiananmen Square, let alone the Cultural Revolution, a much freer place than it used to be. And we've sort of watched as Xi Jinping has consolidated power and imprisoned more people and so on with horror. And I think even in the absence of Trump, again, I'm one person, but I do talk to some other people. And again, it is what I like to say is the people I know aren't representative of much of anybody. But how do you disentangle Trump's effect with just the fact that China's government has changed its behavior in the last 6 or 7 years?
No, Richard, I think that's a very important question. And my response to it is actually to repeat sort of what I said, in the sense that among his supporters, Trump has single-handedly turned them in a negative direction towards China. So statistically, the impact would be there no matter what. But the fall, the grand drop, is true because of what China has done and increasing awareness of what China has done. And so I think I completely agree. I think that for people who are not, followers of Donald Trump, what matters with China is pollution, it's human rights, these kinds of things. And those stories have been quite negative for some time, with the exposés regarding the detention of perhaps 1 million people because of who they are, not anything they may have done in Xinjiang, as kind of the classic example. And that's also, of course, why China recently, in expelling reporters, targeted the 3 publications that had done most to bring this to Western attention: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. And so absolutely, I agree completely that it's not just Trump, but you can definitely see, in terms of kind of by people who identify as Republicans and people who identify as Democrats, that there was a night and day shift. In 2017, when, let me actually punch back here. So in 2017, when Trump had spent the 2016 campaign bashing China, but in 2017 he was hoping for China's help in dealing with North Korea. So Xi Jinping became his best buddy, and they shared chocolate cake in Florida and all of those kinds of things. But then in 2018, when the trade war begins, we start to see this massive shift. And by 2019, when the impact of the trade war is being felt, and it's become, this fully armed trade war, the impact was there. So I completely agree with you that it's more nuanced than just the Trump effect. But the Trump effect is definitely there in terms of kind of the timing and the groups that moved in this way. So I was at Torrance Costco, and they were out of Calrose rice. They're never out of Calrose rice. So this was my early indicator that uh, people who were kind of most connected to Asia. By this time, of course, the meltdown had occurred in not just China, but also in South Korea and in Japan. And people who were plugged into diaspora networks were aware of this, and so they stockpiled the Calrose rice, leaving me empty-handed. American businesses talked about this kind of impact. And the one thing that I want to draw your attention to is only 1/3 of companies didn't think that this was going to be a significant long-term economic impact. So virtually, 2/3 of the American companies based in China thought, hey, this is going to matter. This is going to matter, not just now, not just for the next few months, for the long term. Well, one business that's been focused on China is very important locally here, the film business. And Americans have wanted to show movies, American filmmakers have wanted to show movies in China going back to 1971. Before Nixon even went, you had lobbying to try and get American films into China. Well, and this is why. Now, it took a long time. It took 4 decades. But what we've seen is a dramatic expansion of the film market in China. And Hollywood has cashed in. A lot of films that would have been utter budget disasters have survived and, in fact, returned a lot of money to studios and filmmakers because of the China market. And you can see China on this steady rise up to matching North America in terms of its importance for filmmakers. And so any relatively big budget film, they're considering, okay, how will this play? How will we market it in China? Are there ways that we can increase our prospects? That kind of thing. There's a lot of focus on that. But what? When you don't let Chinese go to the cinema, that's a big impact, right? Massive losses. So they announced a couple weeks ago that they were reopening theaters. That didn't go very far. You buy your tickets, most people buy their tickets online. They buy a specific seat in a specific theater for a specific showing. And tracing this, you can trace this from your home in North America. What do we see? We see that people still are not going to the theaters. Only 500 of 11,000 theaters are open. And so this had a big impact for several companies, including Disney, which had a Marvel film opening, had Mulan and these other things. Trade took a hit. In part, it took a hit because to put stuff on ships in Shanghai or Shenzhen or wherever you want to put them on ships, you've got to get them to the ship. You got to put them on a truck. You got to get them on a train. Somebody has to make something, fill up a container, and get it to the port. And so ports were actually giving shippers discounts because of delays and a lack of business. Well, there is a good news side of this. There's a good news side of this. Lower economic activity clears the air. And Chinese are kind of ingenious at coming up with little slogans. And so when there's a political event that causes the government to shut down factories, they'll name the blue skies after that political event. So Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, that meeting that was held, they called that APEC blue. Well, right now you've got COVID blue over China. And you see this. Now, this is from late February. These are NASA satellite images. And you can see that kind of comparison. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to 2 things. One, you see the pollution, not centered on Wuhan, but up in the north near Beijing and the like. But there's a lot of pollution in China. And on an average day, 4,400 people die prematurely because of air pollution. So what this means, this is a World Bank calculation. that the number of excess deaths produced by the increased problems that people have in terms of respiration and things like that, on an average day, 4,400 die. And what this means is that there were a lot of people in China in great jeopardy because of this disease, because this disease went hardest at people with pre-existing respiratory illnesses and the like. And so the first point is that China's pollution made it especially vulnerable once the disease emerged. Second point is actually the Chinese kind of propaganda apparatus is highlighting traffic jams that have emerged in Beijing. And there's an element of truth to that, but it's also true that there are a lot of people driving who used to take the subway, and they're too afraid to take the subway. And so the streets are more crowded. Metro ridership is down by 2/3 in Beijing and Shanghai. So not normal, not even close. Now, there were some democracies that coped pretty well with the COVID outbreak. Ours was not one of them. Italy, certainly not. Spain, no. Probably in Europe, more or less the same. But two democracies that did pretty well, especially given their proximity and their level of interconnectedness with China, were Taiwan and South Korea. And here you have Taiwanese chemical warriors, and that's actually the name, okay, Huashui Bing. And the only reason you can tell that they're Taiwanese is because of the traditional Chinese characters and the Taiwanese flag on the shoulder of one of these guys. So the Taiwanese responded very quickly. And had we been as responsive, we might not be in such desperate circumstances today. Unfortunately, we did not. Now, I'm not going to go through this. These stats are a week old. I need to update them. But the key point is that more Americans have died from this disease than officially in China. Now, there's some reason to doubt the Chinese statistics. And my guess is that it's some multiple of the 3,100, 3,400 deaths. Some people say maybe 10 times that. I kind of doubt that because I think that kind of scale would have bled through even the Great Firewall. But it almost certainly is some multiple of the number. But again, this is now a worldwide disease, major impact. Now, in the early going, there's a lot of emphasis that people die from the flu. Sure, they do. But a lot more people have gotten the flu and survived it. So these are the issues. Well, we're going to end here by talking about the politics, because the politics are so intertwined with this. So Xi Jinping and his government failed. They had knowledge in December. And by they, I mean both local officials and central officials. They notified the World Health Organization about this contagion. And Chinese scientists had already established that human-to-human transmission was possible. Taiwanese scientists had established this as well. The World Health Organization didn't announce that that was possible for another couple weeks. And in China, there was a failure. So here's propaganda pictures showing the leadership in charge. This guy is unemployed. He was one of the first unemployed, the mayor of Wuhan, who was removed after he said, you know, we told the provincial folks that's what we were supposed to do. And that's not an ideal career move in a centralized state to blame your boss. They failed not just the international community by coming clean with this. They failed, and I apologize, my internet connection, I just got a signal, is somehow weak. But in any case, they failed because they didn't take action at the time to stop things like this. Now, in Wuhan, there's a district. Every year they get together for these gigantic banquets. Bring your own. 40,000 people gathered on January 18th. By this time, they knew, the officials knew, and they permitted this to happen. They further permitted these important political meetings to be held. And this what? This gave the disease a window of opportunity to travel throughout China with the 5 million people who went home for Lunar New Year. And this was a failure within China that the Chinese people aren't going to forget. The propaganda apparatus is busy trying to extinguish this memory, but Chinese people know that their government had a warning and failed to act. In fact, one of the people who warned them was this famous ophthalmologist, not quite 34-year-old fellow, who said, we have this disease. And he put it on WeChat for a number of his associates. And for that, the police called him in and said, you are a rumor monger, you must not do this. And so they typed up the charges against him, this reprimand. He put his thumbprint on it. He said, yes, I understand, I can't do this again. If I do it again, you'll put me in jail. They never got to put him in jail because soon he was in the ICU and then he died. 1,700 medical personnel in Wuhan and the surrounding province were infected. And so again, this could have been mitigated. It couldn't have been stopped. It's unstoppable, but it could have been mitigated and the impact could have been greatly, greatly reduced. And it's because of this that Secretary of State Pompeo and President Trump have pushed back against Chinese propaganda that is busy emphasizing how effective they have been. They say, we don't want people to forget that this disease originated in China. But calling it the Chinese virus has no utility. This disease is not Chinese. This disease is a human disease, and now we have what? More than 3,500 Americans who have died. The expectation, President Trump said maybe 100,000 will die. And so calling it the Chinese virus serves no useful purpose, except to engender hostility towards China. Richard, I could talk for another hour or so, but I probably need to shut up so that people can raise questions. We can talk about how I can show you a clip from Bruce Lee and his determination not to be the sick man of Asia. Suffice it to say, Bruce Lee beats everybody up, those sorts of things. But I should stop now so that we could focus on the things that you folks would like to focus on.
So thank you very much, Clay. As always, very informative and engaging. Questions? Do you think that, what do you think about rates of reentry? So once this thing is over, how long are people going to be scared? And will there be a difference between China and the US in terms of willingness to reenter the public sphere?
I think in China, there's more fear than in the United States at present. But let's wait. And as the disease plays out, re-entering, here I assume you're talking about ordinary people.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Going out, shopping, doing all these kinds of things.
Going to restaurants.
Chinese in seclusion did exactly what Americans have been doing. They went crazy on social media. They streamed all kinds of movies, and they went wild on video games, so much so that Tencent had to bring an entire server farm into service to try to facilitate people playing video games. There is an anxiousness about this, but people are anxious to get to work and to do different kinds of things, but they're really quite scared. And one reason they're scared is they don't trust their government. The government's saying, look, go back let's get this economy going. It's safe. If it weren't safe, we wouldn't send you back. That sort of thing. And so there's this nervousness. Why should we believe you now? Because, what you said before was incorrect. But I think that, if we look at what happened with SARS, people did eventually get back. As it happens, we're at a key week in China because this is an important family festival period called Qingming. And this is where you remember the dead. And it's at a moment like this that there's a lot of issues with regard to social stability and things like that. I think Chinese will go back out and will buy and will do all of these things. But there are a lot of things that they're probably not going to do in the same numbers. One of them is buy cars. The auto industry China's auto market is the largest in the world, but it's been in decline actually for the last 2 years. So that's an issue. Housing and things like that. That's probably still considered a very safe place to invest your money. Because Chinese don't pay property taxes, there's no disincentive to buy property that you just sit on as a speculator and wait for it to increase. That may continue. The urbanization trend, all of those sorts of things are likely to continue. China, in terms of its strategic use of both credit, with credit, it's not been so good, but with strategic investment of stimulus funds has been pretty effective. In the United States, we'll have to wait and see. It's way too early. Many of us are going stir crazy already, but we are just at the start of this period, right? And so we have to digest what it means to stay at home. Most of us are starting to understand that we have to do this, that this is, in the absence of a vaccine, the only thing that we can do to keep from this becoming, even more widespread. So we understand that. I'm interested in the politics of the stimulus, the $2 trillion. Because in response to the stimulus in 2008, the TARP, 2008, 2009, people call bailouts and things like that. In 2010, Republicans uniformly ran against the Obama stimulus, ran against this. And China was their favorite vehicle because some companies invested money in solar manufacturing in China. And so there were a lot of ads. And in fact, I apologize. I intended to include one of those ads. I don't think that happens now. One of the striking things, of course, is the immediate and widespread popularity of Keynesian economics. We understand we need this infusion.
So Robert Lucas, who is a well-known, very market-oriented economist at the University of Chicago, once said, "We are all Keynesians at foxholes."
Yeah. No, I think that's a very apt description. And in fact, I think this has come up in past efforts, right? Any kind of, and in fact, you might even describe the tax cut of 2017 as this effort of fiscal stimulus and that sort of thing. But I think you're absolutely right. And in terms of who comes back and how fully, both economies had big structural issues before this. And it's not clear to me that the stimulus going on in China or here is going to somehow fix those problems. We're just trying to avoid a catastrophe.
Right. Well, the thing is, something that I glom onto is if you look at the resilience of strong economies, and yes, we have structural issues, but we're basically a strong economy. The human capital that we have, the know-how that we have, that has not disappeared.
That's right.
And, people attribute the rise of Germany and Japan after World War II to the Marshall Plan, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But also, here's the fact, is these are just two economies that had a whole lot of people who knew what they were doing. And they didn't lose that ability to do what they knew how to do. And so this isn't to suggest there won't be pain, but the idea that we're going to sort of sit here for years as a result of this depressed, I don't think will happen, but we'll have to see. Let me ask you one more question that sort of you alluded to, and that's come from the audience that I think is, and I'm going to just summarize it this way. Do you think Xi Jinping is in trouble? Or, and there have been some stories in the press about this. The more sophisticated question is, do you think this is going to strengthen or weaken the Communist Party going forward in China?
Excellent question. And, again, my crystal ball is pretty cloudy. I'm a historian by training and more comfortable looking at the past than I am at the future. First, I just wanted to agree with you. I think that you don't lose the know-how just because you don't get to use it for a while. And so I think that I do agree with you. I don't see the recovery as being quite V-like. And so we have to wait and see. But I agree with you. There's no reason that this should, cripple either economy. It does give us some suggestions about our fragility and the need to build in greater resiliency by diversifying supply chains and all that. And
some redundancy would be useful.
Yeah, some redundancy would be useful. You can't have, the only reliable source of face masks be in one place, right? So you're absolutely right. We need to diversify, and standard economics would tell you that, right? Not to put all those eggs in one basket. But with regard to the impact on China's Communist Party and the guy who is at the top of it, Xi Jinping, it's really too early to say. This has been a far bigger hit in terms of China's standing in the world, right? A poll came out that showed something like 73% of people in Britain, 70% of Americans. And so despite all of the propaganda about China to the rescue, 70% of these people responding to the poll said China screwed this up. A lot of the blame, not all of it, certainly, we bungled our way forward, but a lot of it belongs on China's shoulders. But what the world thinks of China is pretty irrelevant to the internal political dynamics within China. And the propaganda apparatus is in overdrive right now, talking about the reason we are getting better. Okay, it's true. We had a terrible situation. We had to lock it down. But now the United States has more deaths. Italy has more deaths. Spain has more deaths. And so within China, the propaganda apparatus is pounding home the idea that it is centralization of authority. And it is the thoroughgoing power of the party state that saved China. But this goes back to the reinfection question. Because if there's a big flare-up in China, that will not rebound to the credit of the Communist Party. And there are some big issues. Now, one good thing that's happened is that there's been a lot of scientific cooperation as well as competition to come up with solutions. And in fact, Chinese scientists and American scientists, as well as Australian, French, Italian, they're all working on this problem. And it speaks to the utility of being connected. There are some Americans, Tom Cotton in the Senate and others, who are pushing for decoupling. Decoupling simply can't happen. The Fortune 500 will educate people on that. But as you said, building in redundancy, building in strategic capacity, that should happen. And a responsible government should do that.
Okay, so Clay, we have blown past our time, but the time has flown. We've flown and blown past. Thank you so much for taking time out of your morning with us. Thank you, it's gratifying to see how many of you stuck around. We really appreciate you participating in this. We are trying to be nimble here, and as we just have opportunities to share things with you, provide them to you. So have a great morning, everyone. And Clay, again, thank you so much.
Thank you all for your patience, for tuning in. I hope this met your needs
Clay,
and expectations.
Fabulous.
Good
Wonderful.
deal. Thank you.